Michael, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. This is a pleasure and an honor, and thank you so much for taking some time to chat with myself and with my listeners.
Delighted to be with you.
So we're going to talk about your book, which I have here, Conscience Incorporated, and I would love to start by getting a bit of an overview of the origin story of this book. And there's a lot going on in the world, and it seems like, a timely book given all of that. And I'm just curious what led to you writing it.
Yeah, and it may be more timely now than when I actually wrote it. But I came I came out of government. I was in the State Department in the Obama years working with Hillary Clinton. And one of the things I did there was to build a unit in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor focused on the U.S. government's relationship to companies and this issue of human rights relating to business. And it was striking to me that there really was not a refined way or a very well-developed way for the U.S. government to engage, especially with U.S.-based companies. We were happy to help improve their role in the world, to improve their market share, to improve our balance of payments. There were lots of public-private partnerships. But when it came to actually talking to companies about their human rights behavior, their responsibilities, there was a kind of silence or a shyness of sort of pushing them. And so we set this unit up in probably 2009 when I came in, early 2010. And as I got into it more and more, I realized this is a real important field. And so coming out of government, I came to NYU Stern, the business school, and with a colleague from the State Department opened what is the first human rights center at a business school. So it seemed fairly obvious to me that business educators helping to shape the next generation of business leaders ought to be thinking in a globalized economy, issues of labor practices in global supply chains, or issues relating to technology, privacy, free expression, range of issues there. Issues relating to the investment sector. There are lots of human rights issues that are affecting companies. And our goal here coming to Stern was really to begin to kind of tackle those issues, both in terms of teaching, research, and engagement with companies. That was 12 years ago. So the book is really, we've set up this Center on Business and Human Rights. Now we have a fair amount of experience tackling these issues in a practical way. And so the book is a distillation of what we've done and a kind of broader look at the field as it is today and what both business educators can be doing, but also more broadly what companies themselves can and should be doing and what governments need to be doing to regulate business conduct when industries or companies are not willing to do that which, in fact, they need to be doing.
Okay. We'll unpack quite a bit of all of this, I think, and I think it will be quite informative. But I wanted to get some of your thoughts around, you've written in the book about the primacy of shareholder capital and Milton Friedman and what you found in those early days. And I'm just curious how the thinking in business schools has changed, or maybe at Stern it has, but maybe elsewhere it hasn't. And what did you find when you started talking about these things within a business school context, and how has that shifted?
So when I got here, I was stunned actually by the amount of attention an article written in 1970 in the New York Times Magazine that Milton Friedman wrote was still assigned reading in half a dozen courses, finance courses, economics courses. It was still the mantra of people teaching finance and investment that shareholder maximizing short-term shareholder returns is the coin of the realm.
Mm-hmm.
And economists would talk about not necessarily disparagingly, but not with great enthusiasm, about externalities. Things like climate change, the fact that our planet is burning up, the fact that we have now a global supply chain for mining, for manufacturing, for fishing, for farming. And the treatment of workers is an externality because we don't own the factory. We don't own the farm. That's somebody else's problem. So it just seemed to me, my gosh, we're living in the 21st century. This is now a different world than Milton Friedman grew up in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we hadn't kept business educators and the business community, certainly the investment community, hadn't kept up with the times. I think it's beginning to change. It's certainly changing in Europe more than in the United States. But there is, even in Europe, I think, still this notion, people still use these terms, fiduciary duty and materiality. There's all of these phrases embedded in the way people invest money and people run businesses that make it extremely hard to take a serious look at what needs to be done. And at the end of the day, a lot of things we're trying to encourage businesses to do costs money. Certainly in the short term, you're not going to change the way a business operates to be more attentive to the well-being of workers halfway around the world, or to moderate content if you're a social media platform, without spending some time, money, and attention. And if you're constrained by maximizing quarterly returns in the next 3 months, it almost precludes you doing what in fact you should be doing and what I would say you need to be doing.
Why should businesses care? I guess it'd be a common question.
So, there are several different paths for companies to come to the table and say, we care about this, we want to figure it out. Traditionally, probably the most obvious or the most hit you over the head reason is because of a company's reputation. And so I cite a number of examples in the book, Coca-Cola operating in South America and Colombia. 2 union leaders are shot on the floor of a bottling plant. Coca-Cola bottles are what they're filling. And the company sued. And more importantly, there's a campaign called Killer Coke, which means that 100 universities in the United States stopped selling Coca-Cola products. I go through other examples with Nike, with Levi Strauss, with Shell Oil, where again, companies have been on the receiving end of really bad publicity, litigation, losing, the youth market, whatever it is. So risk to reputation has always been something that people acknowledge. But it affects too few companies. It's not a systematic way to get where you need to go. The second reason I would say, which is more salutary, is that increasingly, and I hear this a lot from corporate leaders, from CEOs, companies that are going to succeed, again, in a very competitive global marketplace, are companies that recruit and retain the best people. And we have a generational change. So if you're coming out of a business school in 2025 and you're at the top of your class, the odds are you're at least giving a little bit of attention to the climate crisis. And you're going to want to be sure that when you go to a cocktail party, you're not embarrassed by saying, I work for one of those no goodnik companies that's in the center of the storm. And so corporate leaders are saying, I want to demonstrate that we actually care about these things. And it can't just be marketing or, charity. we actually have to do something, and that gets them in the door. The third thing, which happens less frequently, but is always a pleasure for me when it does, companies are made up of people, and people come to come to the dance. They come to become corporate leaders with their own life experience. And you find there are, again, a growing number of corporate leaders that wrote their college thesis on the refugee crisis, or they were involved in the Peace Corps, or they were somehow exposed to some human rights issue in their personal life, or maybe even in their professional life. And it touched a nerve. And they say,
Mm,
I want my values to permeate the culture of the company I'm running. And
mm,
then they find people in their own system who they can work with to make these things real. Some
mm,
combination of those three things generally result in companies coming to the table here and beginning to figure
mhm.
out, what does this mean for us?
Do you run into CEOs who talk about things that they want to do in their roles around respect for human rights and the planet, but also feeling constricted or constrained by short term, meeting the numbers in the short term, and how to navigate that as people versus fiduciary responsibility to
Right.
shareholders, and how do they navigate that? What have you come across?
Yeah. I mean, I run into that every day.
Hmm.
I hear corporate leaders tell me on the quarterly calls with investors, the subject of human rights never comes up, just never comes up. Even climate may come up, but mostly in terms of, a regulation to report on scope 3 emissions, or it's some, again,
Hmm.
risk to the business model. It's
Yeah.
not, oh my gosh, there's an investor telling us we ought to be paying more attention to
Mm.
this. So investors drive the train. And again, I'm speaking 2 miles from Wall Street here at NYU. And I think the American US based investors are particularly narrow focused on those quarterly returns.
Mhm.
And so you get corporate leaders who say to me all the time, I would love to do more on this, but it's just not, the pressure's all coming the other
Mm.
direction. The other thing, which, again, is affecting this, is when I say to them, we'll take a longer term view, these are things that ultimately are going to affect
Mhm.
your sustainability. And I don't just mean environmental
Mm.
sustainable. If you want to be a company in 10 years that's going to succeed, you can't
Mhm.
ignore these issues. It's coming. They say the average CEO, at least of Fortune 500 companies in the US, is in their job for less than 5 years.
Yeah.
So I can't think about 10 years. I can think about
Mm.
it, but I'm not going to be here in 4 years. And so I
Mm.
just have to do what I need to do to succeed in the term that I'm here. And that doesn't give me the luxury of taking that longer term view.
Mm. Something else that I was thinking about when I read your book, particularly this chapter around CEOs, is the amount of compensation, that the difference in compensation between now and I forget the the time when it was sort of the average salary, the average compensation was 20 times the average worker. Now it's 300 something.
Right.
And part of me thinks, well, you've got to make some tough trade-offs if you're in that, if you're in that income bracket. Like you should have the skill to navigate these complex challenges between investor expectations and stakeholders, but perhaps you're not going to be in a job very long if you give up on the fiduciary responsibility to, maximize short-term returns. And it struck me as, you've got to earn your salary around making tough calls where you have to
Right.
navigate trade-offs.
Right. The challenge here is that the incentives have changed dramatically.
Mm.
The figure you cite, CEO making 20 times what the average employee made. It was mid 1960s.
Mm.
And the model there was that the CEO, the chief officer of a company, was really the steward of the company and its well being. They were getting a salary to basically be the most senior employee.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere along the way, the model changed
Mm.
and the compensation became stock futures, not salary.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, the CEO became a significant shareholder, stock shareholder, and looking at the stock price became a kind of obsessive
Mm.
focus. And so you have stock buybacks, you have all these things that make sense from a shareholder's perspective. Somebody's going to hold on to the shares for a couple of years and then cash out,
Mm.
not from somebody who's trying to figure out, will this company be successful in a decade? And so we've sort of created a different incentive structure, which frankly is not in the best interest of the company or
Mm.
most of its employees in the long term. It's really focused on how do we ramp up the stock price as quickly as
Mhm.
possible for the benefit of those people who now own shares and are going to sell those shares to cash out, including the CEO.
It's a little bit bizarre though, if you think about it from the perspective of, we're maximizing for some sort of average shareholder who cares only about like the 3 month outlook rather than the long-term outlook, when in reality, all companies have got shareholders of all shapes, sizes, time horizons, and so forth. And, why can't we maximize for the interest of long-term value investors? And why does it have to be 3 months? And who's the average shareholder who's just only concerned about the next 3 months?
Now, some people have written about this. It's certainly
Yeah.
part of the spirit of my book as well. But, in addition to the structural change I just described relating to the role of the CEO, the investment world has also changed itself. And so you have some giant institutional investors, BlackRock or State Street or Vanguard or Fidelity, that control a significant part of the investment sector.
Mm.
They are running all sorts of mutual funds, passive funds, ETFs. They're basically driving the train. And even though the people whose money they're investing, sometimes it's pension funds or individuals'
Hmm.
retirement accounts, those people really have very little voice.
Yeah.
There is not a moment where BlackRock goes out to all its hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of investors and says, hey, what are your values? What do you care about?
Mm.
And in fact, it's actually worse than that. They've recognized as a marketing maneuver, a marketing
Mm.
tactic, they're going to put out some funds for the green investor or the investor that cares about human rights. They're going to create a whole bunch of funds called ESG funds, environmental social governance.
Hmm.
And then when you read there's lots of promotional things. If you care about the environment, this is the fund for you.
Hmm.
It's basically almost identical to the funds that they're putting out, these passive
Hmm.
funds, these ETFs.
Hmm.
And what they're saying in the fine print is what we're really evaluating is risks to investors, not to people and the planet.
Right.
And so you've got this sort of, you've got 30, 40 trillion dollars of assets in ESG funds, and not one penny of that is looking at which are actually the best companies in terms of climate risk or in
Hmm.
terms of diversity or in terms of
Hmm.
how workers are being treated in the
Hmm.
global supply chain. That's not what it's all about. And so it creates a kind of false sense of, I would say, security among people who do care about these things. I can have my returns on investment and do good by the planet and people. It's just not true.
Hmm. And you talk about this. There's a chapter on ESG investing, but what I also wanted to bring in here as well is this concept of trade-offs, I guess, because you also talk about China. There's a chapter there, and
Right.
there's there are human rights concerns about China, but at the same time there are China is a big manufacturer of solar voltaic cells, and so therefore how does that work out in the whole weighting of can we get some good ESG scores for investing in renewables, and but what it just the mind kind of goes to these weird places of like, how do you make sense of like, is it okay to have a little bit of one of my past guests, his name's Dan Davies, he wrote a book called The Unaccountability Machine, and the way his quote was, well, it seems to me like you can justify a little bit of discrimination if if you invest in something to do that reduces climate emissions or something. It's a very it's ESG is three different things, right? So
Right.
um, it's a very tricky place to navigate. So there are trade-offs.
Yeah.
And your chapters talk about it, because you have a whole thing on cobalt as well
Yeah.
in the DRC, and there are no easy answers. These are tricky questions.
No easy answers. I think a lot of people initially thought you put the environmental and the social together and then you throw in governance, and it's almost too good to be true. It is too good to be true. It doesn't make sense to lump them together.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things we've advocated for in our center, and I talk about it in the book, is you need to disaggregate. You need to be more modest in a way and say, okay, I really care about, greenhouse gases and climate. I want to invest in a fund where somebody's actually evaluating the numbers. I want to know who are the 10 best manufacturing firms on the
Mm-hmm.
issue of greenhouse gases. That's a more manageable thing to look at. The same thing you could do with, outsourcing of labor. Now, that doesn't solve the problem you're also raising, which is that sometimes, in fact, quite often, these things are in tension. But we live with that in all sorts of ways. In our lives, we're having debates now about free speech and hate speech and discrimination. Rights are in tension, issues are in tension, and we have to be able to, I would say, start by recognizing that, and at the same time trying to reconcile those tensions by trying to not be oblivious to the consequences, the adverse consequences. And so let me take the examples you give. There is a law now in the United States that bars products coming from Xinjiang, from the province in China where the Uyghurs
Mm-hmm.
are. There's massive forced labor there. And as you suggest, and as I write in the book, overwhelmingly solar panels, and particularly the
Mm-hmm.
ingots and wafers, component parts, are coming from Xinjiang. We have a law here that says you can't import things coming from Xinjiang because there's a presumption that there's forced labor. Well, I don't want to say to the US government or American citizens or in Europe or anywhere else, don't stop buying solar panels. We need solar panels as an alternative to fossil fuels. But I also don't want people to say, well, we just care about solar panels, so forget about those Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be mindful of both.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing in the Congo. There's 25,000 kids working in these informal mines, artisanal mines. We need the cobalt to make electric batteries function well and not blow up and catch fire. We need to figure out, how do we both protect those kids and families, and how do we continue to produce, to mine cobalt from the Congo, because it's 80% of the world's supply. So these are hard things. They are complicated. The answer isn't to throw up your hands. The answer is to recognize the tensions and try to navigate those tensions in a way that we're mindful of the risks on both ends. We talk to each other and we try to move forward in the most rational way. understanding that it will be a bit more complicated than just having the blinders on.
Yeah, and perhaps we could talk a little bit about the cooperation between governments, NGOs, and companies, because it seems like the ways forward. In fact, you cite an example of multi-stakeholder commitments that have worked, but they also come with tension and conflict and difficult conversations. And if we are going to navigate this stuff, I would have thought that we need to lean into multi-stakeholder initiatives a bit more. In fact, there's a view here that I've heard in Europe that with these new laws that exist in Europe, that multi-stakeholder initiatives are going to go by the wayside, or they're going to diminish in importance, because the assumption is if we comply with the existing laws, then we don't need to engage with NGOs and have difficult conversations about these topics. Whereas you look around and you think, geez, this is really complex stuff and no one has the right answer. And we need to work together to get the right answer. So I'm just curious, going back to some of the examples of things that you've been involved in, the role of multi-stakeholder commitments and dialogue as a way forward in what's an increasingly an unpredictable and challenging world.
Yeah. So let me unpack that question.
Yeah.
There's really a couple of things.
There's a lot there. Yeah.
Yeah. One is, I think naively, some of us I thought that at the end of the day, there would be enough leaders in every industry or many industries who would recognize that these are issues that industries need to tackle. And they would find ways to come up with sort of a common set of standards and metrics, and they would do the right thing. Not entirely, but they would find it in their self-interest to sort this out.
Mm-hmm.
That's generally not the way things work. And at the same, so government, more and more, it's obvious, and it's certainly the trend in Europe, that European publics have said, we're tired of waiting for big oil companies or technology companies or apparel manufacturers to do the right thing. Government needs to regulate. We need some government oversight. But the second thing that's pretty obvious is that governments have a hard time getting their arms around these things and can't do it without industry participation. At the end of the day, these are big, complicated subjects where you have industries basically driving the train. You can push companies to do more. You can even fine them or subject them to lawsuits and liability. But what you're really doing is governments are providing a catalyst that pushes companies to behave better. They still have to figure out what that means. So you need some combination of government regulation, cajoling, regulating, overseeing, and you need companies to change the way they do business. You can't have one without the other. And at the end of the day, each of those things requires some energy. Enter into that discussion the subject of multi-stakeholder initiatives. And I would say overwhelming, there have been, 8, 10, 12 of these in different spheres over the last 20 or 25 years. Most of them, I would say, have been very disappointing. Disappointing to me because industry drives the train. They hate losing control. Industry competitors don't trust each other. NGOs, civil society, weak. And governments are involved in some and not involved in others, but governments are not quite sure where they belong. And so I would say that if you were to grade multi-stakeholder initiatives across the board, I would not call it a great success, although there are elements that are really important.
Mm-hmm.
Industry competitors at the table, coming up with standards, and they're going to be different for each industry, where the industry agrees and signs on,
Mm-hmm.
and some form of evaluating or coming up with metrics. That's the theory. The theory makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one I write a chapter in the book about the one I've been most involved in. I've been involved in 4 or 5 of these, and I have the scars to show that. The one that's succeeded by far the most is an initiative called the Fair Labor Association, which was created in the 90s when there was a lot of attention to sweatshop labor in the apparel industry. It's grown up over 25 years into a real organization with about 50 companies, 50 apparel brands, companies you've heard of like Nike and Adidas and Hugo Boss and Lululemon, etc. And now in the agriculture sector as well, L'Oreal, Nespresso, again, companies you've heard of. The model has worked in a different way because with a lot of early struggles to kind of get it set up, there was a lot of early difficulties in getting everybody to the table and staying at the table. It was an initiative of the Clinton administration, but they kind of stood back and said, this is for industry, civil society, and ultimately universities to figure out. What took place over the first 5 or 6 years was a coming together of a sense. This is not a gotcha exercise.
Mm-hmm.
This is an area where we can genuinely have different views and debate them without destroying each other. But at the same time, early on, a decision was made. This is not just a talking shop or a place where we talk about what we'd like to see, best practices. We're on a journey. We actually are going to evaluate company performance, not just promises, according to standards and metrics. And there's some measure of accountability. That was an early decision fought for very, very hard. And a number of companies walked away. Some of the big American unions walked away. Everybody was taking a chance, staying at the table. And now 25 years later, it's an organization with a 10 or $11 million budget, 50 staff in 20 countries. And there really is a sense, this is a model that makes sense. Last point to what you raised. If people think that somehow governments, the German government or the French government, are going to come up with a model that's just government regulation, that doesn't have some of the elements of what's in the Fair Labor Association, they're deluding themselves. The elements of what we've done in the FLA, and I should say I chair the board of it now, although I'm going off, they're finding somebody else to do that, thankfully. But this is a model that I think will be relevant for a very long time.
Okay.
And governments that are serious about regulating have a number of things that I think they can learn from our trials and errors about what it means to have an industry standard, what it means to have metrics, what it means to have an on-ramp because everybody's not ready on day one, what it means to do independent evaluation on performance, not just process, and what accountability really looks like. Those are going to be the attributes of successful government regulation. And there's a whole lot of learning coming out of what I just described, that if governments are going to succeed, they can take advantage of it and should.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I then want to bring in the current political and geopolitical environment as well, because it certainly, what I think we're seeing on this side of the Atlantic in the United States is worrying, because for a number of reasons, but one is we've seen a lot of companies roll back a number of things on DEI and but it just also, it seems like where we're going geopolitically and commercially, it seems like we're heading into a place where it's transactional. It's might makes right. It's uh, I'm not sure if short-term thinking the is an element, but it's certainly not collaborative, multilateral, and one could perhaps argue not even values driven either. And I think a lot of people who care about this topic are scratching their heads and wondering, what do we do now? Or how do we, what are the next 4 years, 4 minus a few weeks? What is that going to bring?
Yeah, so that's a big subject and a pretty depressing subject to me. I've worked most of my professional life um, trying to advance a rules-based model, values-based model that came out of World War II and in response to the Holocaust and all of that. We built a model that had human rights very much at the center. Security, economic development, human rights. Those are the three pillars of the United Nations. Yeah. And we have now in the United States a new administration that's basically discarding all of that. And as you say, transactional, cynical, it's not at all principled in the way they're operating. So we have a democracy crisis in the United States, a human rights crisis. And one of the components is that we have a president that's a bully, that is, it's not only that he's not beyond being vindictive, that's sort of what he does. And so you have lots of people that should know better, who are going to be negatively affected by the demise of the rule of law, stability, predictability, you name it, alliances that are reliable. Sitting on their hands, there's a lot of hand wringing. There's a lot of people that are scared, but we're 2 months in. I think people are still kind of trying to figure out, what do we do? And my advice to people is, it's not, this is not business as usual or government as usual. We need to be smart and deliberate in challenging that which is abnormal and wrong. Everybody's going to do it a different way. Every individual, every sector of society. But this is I'm an optimist, and I'm ultimately optimistic we are going to meet the challenge and overcome it. But there's going to be a lot of damage in the wake. A lot of people, as always, the most vulnerable people are going to be hurt the most. It's the African, community that depends on USAID for their antiviral drug that's all of a sudden not there. It's going to be immigrants who are being demonized here and put on airplanes without due process. The list goes on, people who lose their jobs. So what I'm saying to people now, including in the business community, and this relates to what you were asking, is, I don't expect every corporate CEO to stand up on a soapbox and start screaming epithets and nasty words at the president. I do expect them to have their eyes open, to be doing an honest cost benefit analysis of what does this mean again for our company and our country. And does it cross a threshold where the negatives, the risks outweigh the benefits? So you've got a lot of companies here that are giddy because there's less regulation. Administration is running away from regulation, you name it, drugs, the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And the administration is promising big tax cuts. So in a very, immediate way, a lot of companies say, hey, less regulations, we save money, less taxes, we make more money. Those are the benefits. The downsides are harder to quantify,
Mm.
but I think they're more consequential. And so I write a chapter in the book about
Yeah.
when should a CEO speak out. And I
Yeah.
actually take a quite cautious or conservative view. A lot of companies, CEOs over the last decade or more have felt compelled, again, because of their own personal
Mm.
interests or personal values, to speak out about reproductive rights or LGBT rights or
Mm.
guns or whatever it is, the issues of the day, George
Mm.
Floyd, issues of racial inequality. I think you have to be very, very careful if you're running a big company,
Mhm.
because if those issues are divisive, you've
Mhm.
got people working for you that are on opposite ends of the spectrum.
Mhm.
And so I advise caution on those things. And I have one exception to that, which is action that undermines the basic underpinnings of democracy. And when I wrote the book, a year ago, I
Mm.
focused on efforts to undermine the functioning of the election in 2020 and efforts in states like Georgia to basically prevent people from voting. I said that goes to the core of democracy. Well, that seems
Mm.
like child's play compared to where we are now,
Mm.
where you have the potential, the very real potential that the president of the United States and his minions are going to say, we don't have to obey court orders. If the court makes a decision that goes our way, we're going to either try to get rid of the judge or ignore the court order. That's a red line for me. We have
Mm.
people in the administration suggesting maybe Trump can serve a third term, or we don't need an election at all. That's a red line.
Mhm.
So I don't know exactly where this is heading, but I am certainly urging corporate leaders collectively, maybe privately at the beginning, to recognize that we all have skin in the game. And if we're going to hold on to our democracy and not completely disappoint the world, in
Mm.
addition to ourselves, we've got to take a look at what's going on and say, this is a 5 alarm fire. This is not
Mm.
business as usual. It's not a slight
Mm.
aberration. We really have a basic challenge to the thing that's made this country great
Mm.
over 250 years, a commitment to the rule of law, a commitment to democratic norms.
And I am curious about that juxtaposed against you have a section in your last chapter, what investors should do. I'm wondering, same conversation. Obviously, I presume when you wrote this chapter, we didn't have President Trump, and I'm not quite sure the timelines when you're writing it in relation to the election. But I'm wondering how you might rewrite or add a few things to that, given the current situation from an investor perspective.
Well, yeah, I think I'm sure I would add more than a few lines, both
Yeah,
for
yeah.
investors and for, the leaders of Fortune 500 companies. Um, I think the issues are the same. At the end
Mm.
of the day, um, the thing that has driven the U.S. economy and the U.S. society um, is a constitutional culture based on the rule of law. Businesses, investors are the biggest beneficiaries of that.
Mm.
The United States is not a country that has a common language, ethnicity, come from all over. We're a melting pot. And so from the beginning, the framers recognized that the big unifier would be a constitution, first constitution in the world.
Mm.
And it was based on some very simple notions. No man is or woman is king or queen. We have institutions that are
Mm.
bigger than any individual. The institutions allow a reasonable resolution of disputes. We have courts that follow the law and that
Mm.
are above or to the side of politics. We
Mm.
have an independent press. We have,
Mm.
other institutions, a non-governmental system. De Tocqueville wrote about that in the
Mhm.
1840s.
Mhm.
Those are the building blocks of a successful democracy. that survives for 250 years
mm,
and that has been the economic engine of the world, certainly in the last 50, 60 years. Nobody has competed financially more than the United States. It's not an accident that we also have had a strong democracy. Now, I don't want to say nobody else
yeah,
is a good democracy,
yeah,
but I will say as a patriotic, maybe somewhat chauvinistic American, I'm proud of those things.
yeah,
And I think if I'm an investor living, working in the United States, if I'm a corporate leader, or if I'm a religious leader, or I'm running a university,
mm,
or I'm a military leader, or I'm a head of a scientific society,
mm,
all of the things I just described are the secret sauce that gives me a leg up.
mm,
And as fast as we're tearing those things down,
mm,
I think it's pretty obvious that the advantages that have accrued to the United States are going to be
mm.
weakened very, very quickly and very considerably. And that to me is a tragedy.
I also agree with you. I'm also, however, thinking about what someone looking at the world from a Russian or a Chinese perspective might say. So in the 90s, there was sort of this belief that through capitalism, democracy would come to places like Russia and China, and that hasn't been the case. Or maybe we could argue that we've got the order wrong there. Um, and now it seems like the U.S. administration, the current U.S. administration, is actually the worldview is pretty much aligned with the Chinese or the Russian worldview, and that it's all about power and might makes right, and who cares about democracy and human rights and these things that are enshrined in international international law. Um, but we can the the world has moved on from that. Maybe the 21st century will not be the American century, and sorry, there's a lot there, but just maybe your reaction to that. How from the majority of my listeners are from the U.S. and Canada and from Europe and the United Kingdom, and people who believe in these values, and we're probably concerned about what's going on. I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts and before we start to wrap things up. But
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a fair question. I would say, again, I have a pretty deep faith and optimism that the big institutions in this society
mm,
are still rooted in the democratic, rights oriented, law oriented tradition that served the country well. I would distinguish between Donald Trump and his gang and the American people. Now, undoubtedly, there are a majority of people who voted in the election voted for Trump. I
mm,
don't think they voted for everything that he's doing or the way he's doing it.
mm,
And so this chapter is still being written, and we're far from the end of the book.
mm-hmm,
And I would say, watch this space. Let's see where we are in 6 months, and certainly in 2 years or 4 years. There's a lot of incompetence and a lot of reactive, intemperate action being taken, vindictive action that will fail. There's a lot of people that are very angry in our own country, not just
mm,
Canadians. And I
mm,
apologize to all Canadians on behalf of my country. There's a lot of people in this country that are watching this in horror, including
mm,
people who voted for Trump.
mm,
And people are afraid to speak out. They're
mm,
afraid of the bully. They're afraid of being singled out. But we are a long way from abandoning our values and our
mm,
traditions and embracing the Vladimir Putin worldview.
mm,
I sort of come back to my time in government where I traveled to 50 countries, including Russia and China, but I traveled to a lot of places where
mhm,
there was a lot of anger about, U.S. arrogance and U.S. abuse of power and all that. The United
right,
States has never wildly popular in a lot of the world
Mm,
because we're a big, arrogant superpower. But at the end, I would be in meetings in Pakistan or in Egypt or in Indonesia, and people would spend a good half hour telling me how much they were angry with the United States.
mm,
Human rights activists,
mm,
academics, journalists, whoever I was talking to. And then at about a half an hour, they would say, but, in spite of all that, we really need you to speak out. We're counting on you.
mhm,
And so I would think to myself, it's kind of interesting. We've made lots of colossal mistakes historically and even recently, the Iraq war, the list goes on and on.
yeah, mhm,
But at the end of the day, people wanted a strong country to be espousing the views of individual liberty and dignity and humanity and justice. And they weren't going to count on the Chinese to do that. And
yeah,
they weren't going to count on the Russians to do that.
mm,
And so we're now, if an American official now goes and have those same conversations, the conversation will not shift after 30 minutes. We've lost our moral high
yeah,
ground, if you were,
mm,
but there's room to regain it.
mm,
We have to get our own house in order. We've got to cleanse ourselves of the backsliding that's going on at a furious pace. We've got to rebuild our own institutions and our own commitment to the rule of law internally. And then we have to go repair the damage around the world. It will be a
mm,
long
mm,
and very arduous process, an
mm,
uphill climb. We may never get to where we were when I was in the government, but that's my aspiration.
mm,
We have to recommit to our own democracy. We have to reject what's going on now. And then we have to rethink our role in the world. Maybe we'll be a little bit more modest and humble.
mm,
Maybe we'll be in a better place to collaborate rather than to dictate. But I think a world in which the Chinese and the Russians dictate how policy is made and how decisions get made is not a healthy world.
mm.
And so we should not stop trying to get back into the game in the way that we once were very much involved and often in the lead.
Wonderful. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. And I would add there's a role for business in that, right?
Absolutely.
And your book has offers a number of great ways forward and great ways to think about it. Was there anything that you wanted to mention before we wrapped up?
No, I'm fine. That's good.
Okay. Good. Okay. Mike, thank you very much. The book is called Conscience Incorporated, Pursue Profits While Protecting Human Rights. And it's, I presume, be available wherever you can get books. And I urge my listeners to pick up a copy. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Really good talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you.